evening and welcome. Tonight I'm going to read to you some children's stories from the Philippines out of this really cool book. Apologies for the squeaky chair as usual. So, this is my favorite drawing. I asked you guys on my Instagram which stories I should read. I just posted a picture of this with no context and said just pick based on the titles which ones you want to hear. So I'm going to read your guys' choices, and then I'll go through and read a couple of my favorites. We're going to start with the very first one, which I'm glad someone suggested because I think this is my favorite one. It's Why Mosquitoes Buzz Around People's Ears. A long time ago, in a fish pond not far from the rice fields, there lived a giant crab named Mugga. Mugga was no ordinary crab. He was king of crabs, and everyone was afraid of him. Not only was he always in a crabby mood, he was almost twice as big as his crab cousins. When Mugga was mad, his big claws would go snap, snap, and everyone, the fish, fireflies, worms, frogs, mosquitoes, snails, birds, would run away. One night Mugga couldn't fall asleep, which wasn't at all unusual. As everybody in the pond kingdom knew, Mugga always had trouble sleeping. They also knew that if anyone dared wake him from his sleep, Mugga would get very angry. That night he crept in and out of his house restlessly, trying to make himself tired enough to sleep. His house was a hole in the mud that led into a deep, dark tunnel underground. Finally, he gave up and decided to call for his old sheriff who lived in a crab hole nearby. "Ka-gang," he yelled into the quiet darkness. "Ka-gang." A while later, Ka-gang arrived. Let's see the picture, it's so cute. Ka-gang arrived at Mugga's side. Though Ka-gang was the sheriff, he was an old and brittle crab, and he could barely outrun a worm. "Yes, sir," he said, his gray feelers twitching. "What can I do for you, sir?" "Gather up all the frogs you can find and bring them here," Mugga said crinkly. "I can't sleep, and I want them to sing to me." Several minutes later, Mugga was back in his house, listening to the frogs sing. "Kokak, kokak, sit back, blit-eat, blit-eat. Now go to sleep," the frogs chorused. Mugga soon fell into a deep, deep sleep. He snored loudly. I'm not making those sounds, that's what it says to do. Ka-gang began to feel a bit sleepy himself, so he too crawled into his own hole to go to sleep for the night. "Kokak, kokak, sit back, bleat-eat, bleat-eat. Now go to sleep," the frogs went on singing. Then suddenly, fat raindrops began to fall from the sky. "Wah-ha-ha," one of the frogs said, laughing. "The king's snoring so loud it's beginning to rain." Then all the other frogs began to laugh too. "Ha-ha-ha," they said, holding their bellies. The frogs were having so much fun they didn't even notice Mugga coming out of his hole. He was wide awake and mad. Rooster woke up too. "Oh no, let's go," said the terrified frogs. In a panic, the frogs began hopping in all directions, trying to find places to hide. They leaped behind slippery rocks into tall grass and under water lilies in the murky pond. Early the next morning, when the sun was just beginning to shine, Mugga ordered Ka-gang to rally all the frogs for a special meeting. "Why were you making so much noise last night?" he demanded, inching closer to the frogs and snapping his claws loudly. The frogs clung together, shaking. They knew very well that Mugga was strong enough to slice any one of them in half with a single stroke of his powerful pincers. "I am the king," he boomed, raising his claws high above his head. "You must never, never disturb me while I'm sleeping." The frogs looked at each other worriedly. Then finally, the bravest frog stepped forward. "Sir," he said as politely as he could, "we saw our friend the snail carrying his house on his shoulders, so we started to laugh." Mugga looked at him sharply, and the frog lowered his gaze ever so slightly. Even the bravest frog knew better than to challenge Mugga. Mugga nodded thoughtfully. I see, he said. The snail made you all laugh. Yes, sir, said the frog. Well then, Mugga said, his tone softening a bit. I will pardon you this time, but the next time, snap, snap. You're all going to get it. And with that, Mugga dismissed the frogs and turned to the old sheriff. I want you to find that snail and arrest him. A couple of hours later, the old sheriff returned with the snail, who started shaking when he saw Mugga's giant pincers. Snap, snap. Mugga's claws went. You, he said, pointing a claw in the snail's direction. Why were you wandering around last night with your house on your back? Sir, stammered the snail, the firefly was playing too close to my house, and I was afraid it would catch fire. Mugga remained silent for a moment. I see, he said. It was the firefly that made you wander on my property with your house on your back. He looked at Kagong, who was standing guard next to the snail. Do you believe his story? He asked. The old sheriff nodded. I think he's telling the truth, sir. Then let this snail go and arrest that firefly, Mugga ordered, his claws twitching with anger. Find that firefly now. Oof. Kagong returned at noon, the firefly nervously fluttering beside him. Oh, whatever it is, she said tremulously. I swear I didn't do it. Be quiet, Mugga said, fuming. The heat from the sun was now beating down on his back, and he was growing madder and madder by the minute. Firefly, explain why. Snap, snap, snap. You were carrying fire near the snail's house last night. The firefly's wings suddenly went still, and her face dimmed. She was so scared she couldn't move. She began. Well, speak, Firefly, Mugga said impatiently. I haven't got all day. The Firefly tried again. I had to turn on my fire to keep the mosquito away, she explained. He was trying to bite me. The Firefly story seemed perfectly believable to Mugga, but before he could give Kagong the order to arrest the mosquito, the old sheriff spoke up. You want me to find the mosquito and arrest him, sir? He said, sounding tired. Bring him to me now, he raged, rapidly snapping his pincers. Snap, 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 snap. Kagong dutifully took off in search of the mosquito as the Firefly fluttered away. Late in the afternoon, he returned with the humming mosquito. Well, hello, King, the mosquito said. Why have you invited me here? There he is. Then he casually buzzed over to where Mugga was sitting. Mugga didn't like the mosquito's tone one bit. He didn't even seem afraid. Snap, 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 went his claws threateningly. Snap, snap. Why were you trying to bite the Firefly? The mosquito laughed, buzzing even closer to Mugga. I'm a mosquito, aren't I? He said cockily. It's what I do. You will be punished, Mugga roared, his eyes bulging. Then the mosquito flew swiftly up into the air and poked Mugga right in the eye. He knew that the eyes were the only soft parts of the crab. Ah, Mugga cried, turning bright red. Kagong, he screamed. Kill that little bug. By this time, Kagong was truly exhausted, but he mustered up all his strength and raised his pincers. Snip, went one of his claws weakly. Snip, snip. The mosquito laughed and laughed, even daring to fly between Kagong's claws just for the fun of it. In and out he recklessly flew until suddenly Kagong caught him with one deadly snip. The mosquito stopped laughing and fell to the ground lifeless. Then, out of nowhere, came a battalion of mosquitoes with a humming roar. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Hundreds of the dead mosquitoes' friends surrounded Mugga and the poor old sheriff, poking them in the eyes with their sharp stingers. Snip, snap, Snap! The crabs fought back, but Mugga's powerful claws were useless to him. The mosquitoes were just too fast and too small. Finally, Mugga and Cuckoo gave up and scampered into their holes, with the mosquito battalion trailing close behind. The mosquitoes could no longer get to Mugga and Cuckoo, who were safely burrowed in their houses deep underground. But today, 1,000 years later, the mosquitoes are still waiting for them to come out. So whenever they see the holes of our ears, they're reminded of Mugga's and Cuckoo's crab holes. And that's why mosquitoes buzz around our ears. Let's see. It's another good story. Flip through this real quick to find a good one. And maybe I'll come back to that one. Let's see. I want to read the best ones to you first, at least. Oh, this is a good one. I like this one. The Magic Lake. Pedro sang as he walked up the winding path leading into the forest, his old axe slung over his shoulder. Deep into the woods I go, where wild flowers grow. With my axe I'll make firewood to sell in my neighborhood since 7 years ago. He was a poor woodcutter, and every morning he left his wife and children to chop firewood, in which he sold at the market in the afternoons. He soon noticed a fallen tree by the lake. Perfect, he said. I won't even have to cut down this tree. He got to work right away, swinging his axe with mighty blows. Whack, whack, whack. He was working as quickly as he could, wiping the sweat from his brow from time to time. The sun was beating down on his back, and he wanted to finish the job quickly so that he could get to the market early. But as he raised his axe to take another swing, his blade suddenly slipped off and flew into the lake behind him. Oh no, he said, as the blade disappeared into the water with a big splash. Pedro had only one axe, and he didn't have enough money to buy a new one. Thinking quickly, he took off his shirt and dove into the water. He swam deeper and deeper, but he couldn't reach the bottom of the lake. He tried many more times, but he just couldn't find the blade. As he sat under the shade of a tree, worrying about how he was going to pay for another axe, a beautiful fairy rose up from the water and magically appeared before him. Pedro gasped at the sight of her. Her hair reached down to her ankles, and her eyes expressed purity and kindness. "What's wrong?" she asked. Pedro stood up and hastily put his shirt back on. He explained what had just happened. Then the fairy swiftly dove into the lake and emerged with an axe blade that shone brightly in the sun. It was made of pure silver. "Is this it?" the fairy asked. The woodcutter knew that if he took the blade, he would be the richest man in the local neighborhood, or barrio, as it's called. But Pedro shook his head and said, "No, that's not mine." The fairy dove into the lake again. Soon she reappeared, holding a blade of shining gold. "Is this it?" she asked. Again the woodcutter thought of how much money he could get for the solid gold blade, but he shook his head and said, "No, that's not it either." Once again the fairy dove into the water and surfaced, this time holding Pedro's old iron blade. "Is this it?" "Yes," Pedro exclaimed, "that's mine." Delighted, he took the blade from the fairy. "Thank you so much." "I admire your honesty," she said to Pedro. "Because you are an honest man, I would like to give you the silver blade and the gold one too." The woodcutter's face brightened. "Really?" he said. "But those might belong to someone else." "No," the fairy said. "I created those blades for you." Pedro thanked the fairy again, then immediately set off for home. He was excited to show his wife the gold and silver blades. "We can sell them," he told his wife when he arrived at their cottage, "and we can save the money for the children's schooling." Pedro's wife was very pleased, and she shared the news with all the neighbors. That same night, the woodcutter's story was known all across the barrio. Even the children were talking about the fairy and the gold and silver axes. Everyone was happy except for Pedro's neighbor, Lito. He felt he deserved the gold and silver axes even more than Pedro did. Early the next morning, Lito loosened the blades on 2 of his axes and headed off for the same spot by the lake. He began cutting down a tree, and just as he had planned, the blade flew off his axe and fell into the lake. "Oh no," he exclaimed. Then he grabbed a second axe and took a swing at the tree. That blade slipped off too, splashing into the lake. "Oh," he said, "both my axes are ruined." Then he sat down and pretended to cry. Before long, the fairy appeared and asked him why he was crying. Leto explained that his axes were broken and that their blades were buried in the lake. As expected, the fairy dove into the water. She appeared first with a silver blade. "Is this yours?" she asked Leto. "You found it," Leto said, pretending to be surprised. "What a good diver you are. Do you think you can find the other one?" The fairy dove in again and came up with the gold blade. "Is this it?" she asked. Yes, yes," he said, holding out his hands greedily. "That's mine too." But the fairy held on to both blades and said, "You shall have neither of these blades. I help only those who are honest. Get out of my woods quickly and never come back." Then she vanished. Leto had no choice but to go home feeling very ashamed. "I'm not any richer and I've even lost my 2 axes," he said to himself. "I wish I had been wiser and hadn't been so greedy." Here's another one. You guys requested that I read. The Deer and the Snail. Bembal the snail was peacefully napping inside his shell when a stone knocked into him with a loud crack. "Hey," he said, poking his head out of the shell. "What was that?" He looked around and saw a spotted deer drinking water out of the stream nearby. "Did you do that?" he asked. The deer didn't seem to hear him, so Bembal slid his body over the rocky ground, moving closer to the deer. He said in a louder voice, "Did you throw a stone at me?" The deer's ears pricked forward, and he turned his head in Bembal's direction. "Are you talking to me, Snail?" the deer said in a way that made Bembal feel even smaller than he was. "Yes, I am," Bembal said stoutly. "I asked you if you threw a stone at me." "Well, maybe," said the deer. "It's hard to know. My powerful hooves often kick things out of the way without my even knowing. It happens all day long." With that, the deer lowered his head to the water and began to drink. Now, Bembal had met many other deer on the island of Panay where he lived, but none as rude and arrogant as this one. This one wouldn't even give him the time of day. "I think you should say sorry to me," Bembal said, inching closer to the deer. The deer raised his head once again and gave Bembal an amused look. "And what if I don't? What are you going to do? Run after me?" "Well, yes," Bembal replied confidently. The deer laughed. "You're going to run after me?" he said. "You don't even have legs or feet." "So I can still outrun you." The words were out of Bembal's mouth before he could stop them. For some reason, the deer was making him say crazy things. "You're challenging me?" the deer said, surprised. "I can outrun just about anyone, big or small, fat or thin, young or old." Bembal didn't hesitate. "Yes, I'm challenging you," he said fearlessly. "I'm going to outrun you and make you apologize to me." He stared defiantly at the deer. The deer laughed again, making Bembal even more annoyed than he already was. "Fine," said the deer. "My name is Gaspar, and I will race you when the sun comes up in the morning." "I'm Bembal," said Bembal. "I'll be waiting for you by the old banana tree on the other side of the stream." That night, Bembal gathered all his snail friends and told them what had happened. "How am I going to beat him?" he said worriedly. "What was I thinking when I challenged him?" "Gaspar is very fast," said one of the older snails. "He's probably the fastest deer on the island." Bembal's heart sank. His friends weren't making him feel any better. He wanted to beat Gaspar more than anything in the world. But it was true, he didn't even have legs or feet. How was he going to do it? But as they talked some more, the snails began to think of ways to beat the deer. And by the end of the meeting, they had a very good plan. The next morning, 3 of Bembal's best friends positioned themselves along the race course, which began at the old banana tree and ended at the top of the hill. The first snail went to the small guava orchard and waited there. The second snail waited at the wooden footbridge that crossed the stream, and the third snail posted himself on the fringes of the pineapple field. Bembal's friends all knew exactly what to do. Bembal and Gaspar met at the old banaba tree by the stream. "Are you ready to lose?" Gaspar said to Bembal with a smirk. Bembal didn't answer. Instead, he positioned himself at the starting line and waited for the signal to begin the race. "On your marks," one of Gaspar's deer friends began. "Get set, go." Bembal took off as fast as he could, but Gaspar only stood back and watched him. "Ha ha ha," he said, laughing. "Is that the best you can do? Even my grandmother can move faster than that." Bembal didn't look back no matter what Gaspar said. If his plan worked, the haughty deer would be apologizing to him within the hour. Soon Gaspar was far behind, but Bembal guessed that Gaspar had not even left the starting line yet. He was probably still chatting with his friends, drinking water from the stream or smelling flowers along the way. Bembal knew that Gaspar would be taking his time, bragging to all his friends that a snail was no match for him. Then when Bembal was about 30 meters away from the guava orchard, Gaspar finally passed him at an easy walk. "Ha," said the deer, glancing down at him. "Even with a head start, you're still going to lose." But Bembal wasn't worried. He knew that his snail friend Tara was waiting in the orchard. She would continue the race in his place, while Bembal took a shortcut to the finish line. He positioned himself on the side of the track and watched with pleasure as Gaspar drew closer and closer to Tara. "You better speed up, slowpoke," Tara said, pretending to be Bembal. "I'm going to win." Even from 30 meters away, Bembal could see that Gaspar seemed startled when he saw Tara in front of him. The deer stopped in his tracks for a moment or two. Then he shook his head and picked up his pace, dashing ahead of Tara, whom he thought was Bembal. This, of course, was exactly what was supposed to happen. The snails had planned everything very carefully. Bembal slowly began to make his way to the finish line. He knew that his plan was going to work. When Gaspar arrived at the wooden footbridge, another one of his snail friends would be waiting, and Gaspar would think that Bembal was still ahead of him. And when Gaspar got to the pineapple field, there would be another Bembal look-alike that would fool Gaspar once again. Bembal couldn't help but smile as he slid along a tree that had fallen across the narrowest part of the stream. He was going to beat Gaspar and make him apologize once and for all. I like this picture. On the other side of the stream, Bembal made a steep climb to the top of the hill, where the finish line was. There, just 2 feet away from the finish line, he waited for Gaspar to appear. After a minute or two, Bembal heard pounding hooves coming his way. From the vibrations in the ground, Bembal could tell that Gaspar was galloping toward the finish line. As quickly as he could, Bembal began inching his body forward, pushing and pulling his muscles rhythmically. Although Gaspar was far away, Bembal knew that the deer could still overtake him. He looked back and saw Gaspar crossing the bridge that led up to the final stretch. He saw that the deer had spotted him and was running as fast as he could to catch up. Bembal pushed and pulled and pushed and pulled, faster and faster, until finally he crossed the finish line. A second later, Gaspar galloped past him. His coat was covered in foamy sweat, and his underside was heaving. "I won," Bembal exclaimed. "I beat you." Gaspar didn't say a word. Out of breath and panting, he was totally exhausted from his final sprint. His head was pounding, his body felt weak, and he was seeing stars dancing in front of his eyes. His forelegs began to fold, followed by his hind legs, and the next thing he knew, he was lying in a heap on the grass. "I won," Bembal said again. His only reply was Gaspar's panting. "You have to apologize to me now," Bembal insisted. Gaspar opened his mouth as if to speak, but instead of speaking, he took a long, deep breath. "Well," Bembal said, waiting, "say you're sorry for throwing a stone at me." "Apologize." "Sorry," Gaspar finally said weakly. Then he closed his eyes and passed out. This is another story you guys wanted to hear from my Instagram. It's called A Bridge of Flowers. I really like this one too. A long time ago, Bathala, as God was known to Filipinos in ancient times, asked his messenger to gather all his children for a special meeting. His daughters arrived in heaven first: Tala, the morning star, Iwewe, the dawn, and Tagani, the goddess of the harvest. Then, not 5 minutes later, Bathala's sons arrived. Hangin, the wind, Kidlat, lightning, and Ara, the sun. His 3 sons and 3 daughters promptly took their seats at the big oval table in the main hall of Heaven's palace, waiting for the meeting to begin. They knew that something important was about to take place. Bathala smiled as he watched his children take their seats, proud of each and every one of them. But then he noticed that his youngest daughter's seat was still empty. "Where's Picari?" he asked, scowling. "She's not coming again?" "I looked everywhere," the messenger said, "but I couldn't find her." "Maybe she's playing in the garden," Li Weiwei suggested. "She's absent again," Bathala said, pounding his fist on the table. "This is the—" "Maybe she's just late," Kidlat said, trying to calm his father. "No," Bathala said, his face turning red. "I will not tolerate this. She's done this too many times. "But father," Tagani said, "she's only 14 and she doesn't understand." "No," Bathala boomed. "From now on, she's banished from our home." Shifting in their seats, the other children began to protest. They loved their gentle and kind sister. She was the goddess of flowers, and she had a spirit as free and as colorful as the wildest bougainvillea. Finally, Tagani, who was the oldest among the children, bit her lower lip and said, "Father, please give her one more chance." "Yes, please, Father," Hungin said. "She doesn't mean to make you angry." "No," Bathala said again. "If she prefers to play in her garden, then she can live there forever." Picari was indeed playing in her favorite garden down on Earth. She was busy making garlands out of calistusi flowers that had fallen from the trees, their powerful sweet smell filling her with peace and serenity. Several strands of the white and yellow flowers adorned her neck and hair, and she was softly humming to herself as she strung flower after flower into a piece of string. Soon it was dusk. The deep orange light cast a warm glow on Picari's brown skin, and she sat on a bluff overlooking the calm ocean below, watching as the sky turned from orange to red to purple to dark blue and then finally black, dotted with millions of brilliant yellow stars. Picari was so lost in the colors and smells around her that she didn't notice that her father's messenger was standing close by. "My dear mistress," the messenger spoke, "I've been looking for you since yesterday." Picari took in a sharp breath and abruptly turned toward the voice. "Oh my," she said, startled. "What are you doing here?" "Your father sent me," the messenger said nervously. "He's asked me to deliver a message." "Yes?" Picari said, smiling sweetly. "What is it?" said she pretty. The messenger hesitated for a moment, avoiding her steady gaze. "Well, he began. "He sent me here to tell you that you must never come home again." But why?" Picari said, confused. "What have I done? Is he angry with me?" "Yes, mistress," was all the messenger could say. "But why?" The messenger took a deep breath. "Because you are absent at today's meeting." "What meeting?" Picari said, genuinely surprised. "He called for a special meeting," the messenger explained. "I looked everywhere for you." His voice trailed off. "I'm so sorry," he continued. "You've been banished from heaven." "But I didn't know." She looked at the messenger, her round brown eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know." "I'm very sorry," the messenger said again. "There are too many gardens. I just couldn't find you in time." "I've made my father unhappy once again," Picari said, crying. "And I promised. Oh, so many times I promised to stay closer to home." She was sobbing now, and the messenger turned to leave her. "I wish you well, my mistress," the messenger said, before he disappeared into the blackness surrounding them. Picari cried bitterly for many hours until the sun came up. She thought about going to her father to change his mind, but she knew it would do no good. Instead, she set about making the garden her new home, hoping that in time her father would forgive her. She made friends with the people and the animals who lived nearby, and she created thousands of varieties of flowers. Never before had anyone seen the color she brought into the world with every new blossom. Never before had anyone smelled the scents produced by the flowers. Then one day, Bigari decided to build a giant bower made of flowers, one that arched across the sky and could be seen even by those who lived far away. The blossom-covered monument reached way up into the sky. Green, blue, red, orange, yellow. These were a few of the colors of Bigari's bower. Secretly, she hoped her father would see the magnificent arch and invite her back to heaven. Many years later, he did just that. Today, when we are especially lucky, we can still see Bigari's bower, but we have given it a different name. We call it a rainbow. I think I'm going to read this last story in here to you because I think it's really, you'll see. It's called The Prince's Bride. I want to see all of you married before I die, the old king said to his 3 sons, who had gathered by his bedside. The king's forehead was slick with perspiration, and his voice was barely above a whisper. He had been sick for many months, and every day he grew weaker. Now go, he said hoarsely. Go and search for your wives. Early the next morning, the 3 young princes set out. Traveling with them were servants who carried rice, water, fish, and presents for the future brides. Full of energy and excitement, the princes each took a different route across the hillsides surrounding the kingdom. Days later, Manuel, the oldest son, returned with an elegant woman whose silken hair reached down to her knees. Soon after, Paulo, the second-born son, arrived with another woman equally beautiful and kind. Her radiant smile lit up the king's room, and her skin was exceptionally smooth and luminous. The old king brightened when his sons introduced their brides. I will die happy knowing that you two will care for my sons, he told them. Yes, you are both very suitable for my boys. Then the door opened and a servant stepped into the king's chamber. Your Highness, he said, smiling and turning red, as if he were trying not to laugh. Marco has arrived. Send him in then, the king said. Yes, your Highness, the servant said. Carefully he closed the door behind him, but as soon as he did, he burst into laughter. Ha ha ha. Manuel, Paulo, and their 2 brides looked at one another with puzzled expressions. Why is he laughing? Manuel whispered to his brother. Marco, the youngest son, entered the room. Cradled in his arms was a big, ugly caterpillar as long as his forearm. Meet Berta, he said, stroking the giant worm. She has agreed to be my wife. For an instant, the king said nothing. He just looked at the youngest prince and scratched his white beard. Then his face broke into a wide grin. Ha, very funny, he said. No, father, Marco said good-naturedly. It's not a joke. I'm really going to marry Berta. Ha ha, the king went on laughing. I know she is not what you expect, father, Marco continued, but she has kept me company throughout my journey, and she has won my heart. Ha! The king suddenly stopped laughing and his lips turned white. What? He said, sitting up in his bed. Berta's going to marry me, Marco explained one more time. Get out, the king shouted, and get that hairy worm out of here. I will not have a caterpillar as a daughter-in-law. Marco gently laid Berta down in the rocking chair. Then calmly he approached his father's bed. Father, he said in a serious tone, I respect you and I don't want to make you unhappy. He paused, glancing back at the caterpillar. But Berta is a magical creature. I know she looks like a caterpillar, but she speaks as intelligently as any woman I've ever met. The king grunted and turned his head away from his son. More importantly, Marco said, she loves me, and I love her. Marco reached out over and put a hand on his father's shoulder. Father, please listen. The king, who was a fair and loving father, slowly turned over to face his son. I would be the happiest man alive. No, I am the happiest man alive because of her, Marco said. Please, I beg you, give us your blessing. The king remained silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, he seemed tired and said, You are a fool, he told Marco. But if you don't mind that the whole town will laugh at you, then You can do as you wish. Oh, thank you, Father, Marco said, kissing the king's hand. I'm very grateful. The next day, the king announced that the wedding would take place in 3 days in order to give the brides enough time to weave their own veils. As part of the traditional Filipino wedding ceremony, the veils would be draped around each couple as a symbol of their unity. The brides immediately got to work on their veils, as 3 days was little time to weave a cloth broad enough to be wrapped around 2 people. Manuel's bride wove a delicate cloth using silk and pineapple fibers called sutlang piña. Paulo's bride produced a sturdy fabric made from wild banana leaves called abaca, which he then dyed crimson. On the wedding day, the veils were displayed on the backs of each couple's carriage for all the townspeople to see. As the wedding procession slowly floated down the town's main street, cries of approval rose up from the crowd. God bless you. She's beautiful. Best of luck to you both. May you have many children. But neither of the exquisite veils could compare to the lush silk Berta wove. Yards and yards of the colorful silk adorned Marco's carriage, each one of its brilliant threads gleaming brightly in the morning sun. Yet even though the cloth was stunning, the crowd jeered when they saw Marco's caterpillar bride. She's got more hair than you, someone cried out to Marco. You should have married my goat, another shouted, laughing. The youngest prince is blind. Marco lovingly stroked Berta's fuzzy neck. It's all right, my sweet, he said in a soothing voice. They can laugh all they want, and I'll still love you. At the end of the procession, the couples descended from their carriages and approached an outdoor altar that was set up for the ceremony. From a balcony above the altar, the king watched. Manuel and Paulo stood proudly next to their brides throughout the mass. Marco cradled Berta close to his chest, as though shielding her from harm. Finally, the priest asked the couples to kneel down so that their veils could be wrapped around their shoulders. As Marco began to kneel, Berta suddenly spoke. Put me on the ground and crush me with your foot, she said. Marco looked at her alarmed. What? Why? Please, Marco, Berta whispered. Don't ask questions. Just trust me and do as I say. But now, my prince, the caterpillar bride said urgently, you have to do it before it's too late. Marco shook his head in bewilderment, but he gently set her on the ground as she asked. Then, closing his eyes tightly, he lifted his foot above her and brought it down just below her neck. Even with his eyes closed, Marco saw a bright light suddenly flash before him, and he felt a gust of cool wind. He opened his eyes. In front of him stood the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. He looked at her, astonished. The crowd gasped in surprise. Marco's brothers could only stare. With her full red lips and almond-shaped eyes, the woman's magnificent beauty made the 2 other brides look like poor peasants. I'm free at last, the woman said to Marco, kissing him on the cheek. Thank you. Marco struggled to find his voice. Who are you? The woman tossed back her long wavy hair and laughed. I'm Berta, of course, she said. I was a princess once, but a witch cast a spell on me, and only the truest love from a prince could break it. Berta? The young prince said in disbelief. Yes, my prince, it's really me. Slowly a warm smile spread across Marcos' face. Berta, why, you're perfect, he cried. The crowd burst into cheers. Marco took her in his arms and kissed her. The king stood up from his chair, clapping in delight. By noon, the 3 couples were married, and the whole town celebrated with a fiesta of dancing, singing, and succulent food. Eventually, the king grew to love the caterpillar princess more than his other daughters-in-law, and before he died, he left the throne to Marco, the youngest prince. Alrighty, that's gonna be the end of story time tonight. I can see a frog. So cute. Oh, look at, there's the snail, the firefly, and the mosquito. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found these stories really relaxing and sweet. very good night. Good night.